Up next is DDC FPO's Chad Crotty. You're watching Connections 2021.
Hello, everyone. My name is Eric Johnson, and I'm Senior Technology Editor at the Journal of Commerce and JOC.com. Thank you for joining our session here at SMC3 today, Overcoming Obstacles Through New Technologies. This is an area that I focus on every single day of my life, actually. I'm fascinated by the way that logistics and technology are intersecting and the role that technology can play in helping foster a new kind of way of working in the future. So there's lots to discuss. It's a pretty broad topic, and we're going to cover a lot of ground. And with me today, joining me today is Chad Crotty, VP of Sales and Marketing at DDC FPO Solutions. Chad, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks for the invite. Look forward to covering a lot of great topics. I think you're in good hands. We're going to cover a lot of your favorite topics today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to have, in a second, I'll have Chad introduce himself in a little more depth. But just in terms of the format of the session, after he intros himself, Chad's going to take us through a few slides that kind of describe the way he and his company sort of see the evolving landscape. And then I'm going to come back in, and I have a whole bunch of questions to ask about his experience and what he's seeing in terms of his clients and customers in the broader industry around a whole range of topics. So really looking forward to that discussion. Chad, do you want to give people a little background on yourself and DDC?
You bet. Yeah. Thanks, Eric. So again, my name is Chad Crotty. I'm the VP of Sales with DDC FPO, which is our freight-focused division. The DDC Group is a global business process outsourcing firm. So we operate in countries all over the world. My division focuses primarily in North America, and we've been focused in transportation and logistics industry for the last 16 years, give or take. So we've seen a lot of changes, certainly in the last 15 years, but I'd say it's been advancing at an even greater pace just in the last 3 to 5 years. So, and that will continue. So I've got a brief presentation to kind of talk about some of the highlights of what we'll be covering. And sorry if I jumped in on your part, Eric, but did you have something else you wanted to say, or you want me to just jump right in?
I was going to say that 16-year stretch maps exactly with how long I've been covering this space. So I'm interested to see your, that perspective through the lens of a similar historical, kind of readout on the industry. So yeah, please take it away. Sure.
So, we've historically been a business process outsourcing firm focusing in back office functions, doing data capture, data processing. And have gotten into front office and IT solutions as well. So we've been heavily involved in the tech space over the last several years, and we've seen a lot of changes. But I just wanted to make note as I start the presentation, this statistic is pretty mind-blowing when you think about the breadth of the transportation and logistics industry. So the global logistics industry will be worth more than $12 trillion by 2023, and it's growing, I think, at the pace of about 5% a year. So that's about where we'll be 2 years from now. So it's a big, bold statement, and it's something that I think everybody should take note of as we look at some of the solutions that we need to come up with to address this growth. So today, the main things that we'll be talking about, obviously this is tech focused. So big data, which is kind of an old term, but it's still as relevant as it's ever been. Big data analytics, the ability to take large amounts of structured and unstructured data, create information from that, and then make decisions without human intervention. So we'll be talking a little bit about that. Artificial intelligence obviously plays into that. Data is part of that process. Warehouse technology, the use of autonomous vehicles, robots, things like that. And then obviously the rise of mobile apps. So those are all things that we'll be covering today. So if you look at the next slide, big data. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, what that is, aside from a cool term, is it's the use of data. Carriers and 3PLs collect large amounts of data every single day. And some know how to use it. Some don't know what to do with it at this point, but it's being used on a regular basis to make business decisions, whether it's optimizing freight, it's optimizing fuel, optimizing loads. There's a lot of things you can do with it, but basically what it comes down to is the data that you collect, you want to try and find a solution to answer some of the questions that you have on how you can run more efficiently, and then use that data to make proper business decisions to run more efficiently, more effectively, and more securely. So we'll be covering a little bit of that in our one-on-one session at the end of this presentation. AI, we use a fair amount of that in our own daily operations. Basically, what it comes down to is the ability to allow software to make decisions on our behalf. So you're taking structured and unstructured data, you're creating usable information, whether it be descriptive analytics or descriptive analytics or prescriptive analytics, and make a decision from that. So you're looking at things like on-time delivery, enhanced safety, reducing your operational costs, and warehouse efficiency. There's a number of different things you can do with it. But basically what you're doing is you're taking a lot of the manual processes out of decision making and allowing the software to do that for you. Warehouse technology. So if you look at the stat at the bottom, shipments for logistics robots are projected to reach 259,000 units in the next 5 years, which equates to about $18.5 billion in investment. And that could be machines that pick parcels, to stack freight on pallets, to use autonomous pallet jacks, to load trucks, and basically take that labor cost out of the equation. So that's something that we'll see more and more of. Today, about 80% of warehouses are manually operated. Autonomous vehicles. So again, we hear a lot about that. This is going to be a big driver in the next, I'd say, 3 to 5 years. You'll be hearing more and more about this. The driver shortage has been something that we have been faced with for a decade or more. In the next 5 years, we'll be looking at a shortage of about 174,000 drivers. So obviously there's going to be a need to do something. There's still a demand for freight. There's still a demand for goods and services. So we're going to need to find ways to get products to people and to companies that need them. So autonomous trucks will be one of those solutions. I think it'll be more for the middle mile, for the long haul part of the delivery process. So that's something to keep an eye on as well. And then obviously the rise of mobile apps. We all use them every day. They're being used more and more every day in the transportation industry. You can use apps to find and book loads easily, communicate with customers and brokers. You can use apps to find the cheapest fuel, the nearest fuel stations, and plan routes to include stops for open parking and places to eat. So these are all things that drivers can use to help optimize their time on the road as well. So those are the main areas that we'll be covering today. And I think Eric and I have a little bit of a one-on-one.
Great. Chad, great scene setter there. Obviously, lots to individually kind of digest and dig more into over the next 30 minutes or so. I'm glad you sort of finished on this with like a little bit of a teaser on this slide, the impact of COVID, because we're now 16 months, 15, 16 months into this pandemic. This is probably the third SMC3 conference that we've had to do virtually instead of in person, right? So I'm interested, given the variety of kind of ways that you interact with your customer base. How did you see COVID kind of changing the way companies think about things like disaster recovery, business continuity? Like, what was your big takeaways from the what you saw over the last year and a half?
Well, the transportation industry had to make some hard decisions quickly to stay operational. Each state had a different set of rules for how to apply COVID-19 safety protocols. In some cases, rules varied by county in each state. So one of the biggest impacts had to do with safely operating while maintaining social distancing requirements, both with internal staff and customer contact in the delivery process. So things like working from home on a large scale, having contactless proof of delivery. Another popular area in looking at having backups in place for production. BPOs specialize in this, but with the entire world being impacted at virtually the same time, it made sense to look harder at decentralization and having office staff work from home, offshore, nearshore support to supply the resources required. So there's a variety of different things that carriers and 3PLs had to do, but it all leads back to having a more diverse business continuity and disaster recovery plan.
So what sorts of things did you see kind of best in class companies doing in terms of business continuity, both from a staffing perspective and a systems perspective?
Well, certainly technology played a major role in the decision-making process, looking at data security, system access protocols, establishing a new set of policies and procedures, taking into account having new fail-safes in place for office procedures, collecting and processing data, and picking up and delivering goods. So for a lot of the companies that we work with, they had to work very quickly to move a lot of their staff into a work from home environment. That seems like an easy process, but you're not only having to move equipment, but you're also having to put system access in place, making sure that data security is in place, and then having new policies and procedures for how to go about daily operations. So there was a lot of juggling that had to happen, especially in the first few months of the pandemic. But I think we've all gotten to a point where we're in a good flow now.
For sure. Yeah, I think people have adjusted. Just my perspective, we heard a lot about, especially on the brokerage side, that some companies were just not quite equipped early on to manage a work from home setting overnight. A lot of companies had terminals set up in their office and were not laptop oriented. That created even a 1 week gap, right, was really critical to kind of bridge. And the system security issue you mentioned, obviously we've seen a wave of cyber attacks in our industry, not just globally, but in our industry over the last year and a half. So, more points of access, not quite the same rigor possible as when you have a controlled network in an office, all sorts of, exposure to things that we didn't have to think about in February of 2020. So really interesting stuff. What do you think coming out of this is going to be kind of lasting impacts in terms of business continuity planning? What do you think companies, whether they're on that higher end of the spectrum or whether they were really struggling early on but have adapted, what do you think they're going to carry through with them, 2, 3, 5 years down the line?
Well, as I said, a lot of this has to do with having redundancy in place. I know there was a push for many years for carriers to centralize their billing operations, as an example. Now they're looking more at decentralizing, using nearshore and offshore providers to help provide support. They provide flexibility and scalability. So looking at more of a robust business continuity and disaster recovery plan We have carriers that we work with or that we've engaged with that will use multiple vendors that do the same type of process. So in the event that something like this is to happen in the future, you can kind of move work around to help support. So if there's an issue with, major storms or, a power outage or a global pandemic, again, you can remain operational without creating a bottleneck or completely shutting down your operation.
Yeah, that's a great point. There's these micro kind of events that happen all the time in logistics, right? That people need to be probably a little more resilient around. It shouldn't take necessarily a global pandemic to stir those kinds of plans into action. You mentioned a couple of times the issue of decentralization, right? This is kind of a forever question in kind of business operations: is how much value do you gain by centralizing decisions or using a common system versus autonomy of different units or different regions, empowering people on the ground to make decisions, right? How much do you see kind of that, how that pendulum swinging one way or another based on what happened during COVID?
That's a good question. I can tell you from our own experience, we've seen a lot of carriers taking steps to build out a more robust business continuity plan, and decentralization is part of that. Being able to have multiple people in multiple locations make the same or similar decisions on how operations function, so that in the event that something goes wrong in one area, you've got a backup plan. So I think of before DDC was really a big player in the transportation space. There were a lot of carriers that things happen, right? You get a tornado in Oklahoma, and a truck can't go to that terminal. So what they would do is they would put the bills on a truck, and they would drive it to Nebraska or wherever the nearest terminal was, so that they could keep billing going. And those are decisions that they would make kind of on the fly because they were black in one location. So it's trying to think of things like that may and certainly will come up, and come up with a plan in advance of those things happening, so that you can keep your operations running smoothly.
Yeah, I think that there's been lots of lessons, and I sort of joked halfway through 2020, this is going to be the event that spawned a million case studies. Like there's going to be lots of things that people examine. Their assumptions, right, are going to maybe be a little, kind of ripped up because the things that they thought were sound may not have been so sound, right? Well, let's shift gears a little bit and dive into some of the trends that you identified in your kind of opening remarks. I wanted to actually start off again toward the end of your slides on the mobile app issue, which is, I think, something that it's sort of like I group mobile with cloud. These are these things that for 10 years in transportation were the novelty, the things that people had to get their heads around using. And now you don't really need to convince a driver the benefit of having a mobile phone and using apps that are based in a cloud hosted environment, right? But they don't necessarily think about those things. Where would you say we are in terms of sort of the proliferation of apps, the maturity of apps? Is there still a lot of room to take advantage of that type of environment, or have we sort of reached maturity on that?
We definitely have not reached maturity on that. If you look at the age of drivers in the industry, they tend to be older. I'd say, I don't know the exact number, but I'd say on average they're 50 years plus, and they're not super tech focused, right? So if you look at the millennial generation, I mean, they grew up on technology, so they're used to it. That's saturated, but as we go on and you continue to try and get individuals to fill this space, there's still a lot of room for growth. I mean, one of the points I brought up earlier in the presentation, warehousing. 80% of warehousing is still operated manually. So, there's room for growth there. There's room for growth in trucks. We've seen it in the last couple of years in the use of mobile apps to capture billing data, to take an image of the bill to speed up the billing process. And a lot of that just comes down to the use of technology in the truck, whether you have hardware or software, or the use of a mobile app where you capture an image and you can process from that to start billing sooner, finish sooner, and get invoices out more in a real-time environment upon delivery. So that's kind of the goal, and that's what we've seen in the last couple of years.
Another question on apps. Obviously, there was a term that's kind of come to prominence the last couple of years in the transportation industry, app fatigue, right? A few years ago, a lot of different entities started developing their app, and a lot of them are sort of, from a driver point of view, are quite redundant with one another, and you don't want to be in a position where you have 50 apps to manage 50 different brokers that you deal with, right? So are you seeing any sort of either consolidation and use of apps, or are you seeing it's more about the data that feeds into apps that they already may be using, rather than launching another app on top of something that they're already, not excited about adding a 51st app, right?
You're right. Yeah. I mean, I have to tell you, in talking with carriers, and you mentioned the idea of using an app for this particular process and then a different one for that particular process, you get a lot of eye rolls, right? It's something that nobody's excited about. I think everybody agrees that the use of mobile apps, it does help make us work more efficiently. Everybody has a phone these days. Every adult, anyway, has a phone these days. So being able to do a lot of the things that we do on a daily basis, whether it's do your mobile banking, or check your news feed, or post in social media, those are all things that we do day in and day out. But in terms of providing transportation services, if you're a driver, if you can use one app to do a multitude of different things, not just for pickup and delivery, but possibly for communication, dispatch, processing PODs, whatever the process is. If you have one app to do all that, and then the ability to be able to capture information and process that information in real time, that's kind of the holy grail, I think. Ultimately, what people want to do is they don't want to have to rely on documents. They want to just have the data, right? So if and when we get to that point, there may not be a need for some of these types of technologies, because the data will just be shared through the whole supply chain. But we're still a long ways out from that. So the use of apps, certainly, if you can have one app to do all of these different things, that's really where it's at.
Yeah, it's interesting. I sort of think about it from a driver perspective. I think about it as, if I have to use a different app for different processes, that's maybe not as ideal as having it all in one. But what I want to avoid is having to use different apps for the same process, just for a different customer, a different facility, or different broker that I'm working with, right? That doesn't add any value to the driver's life. So it will be interesting to see more kind of API led approaches that let people kind of live in the apps that they like using the most. So well, let's maybe shift gears again. You talked about warehousing technology, and that made me think of an issue that is really related to technology, a sort of societal issue right now that's very related to technology, which is labor shortages, right? We're seeing, you mentioned the sort of projected driver shortage that's out there. Warehousing, supply of warehousing labor is pretty tight, given how much e-commerce we love and how many new facilities have come up. And then, there's the whole issue of, how automation, which you touched on a little bit, and we'll go into more now, but how that affects kind of service jobs, right? Desk jobs, data, everything from data entry to, higher level decision-making kind of jobs. So I thought maybe we could address these in sort of physical buckets and then service buckets. How do you see some of the automation technology that's coming out on the physical side, whether it's vehicles or the robots in warehouses? How do you see that sort of changing the labor picture in the transportation and logistics space?
Sure. So, as the saying goes, necessity is the mother of invention. When you look around at what's going on, there's no shortage of freight. There's no shortage of people needing things in their daily lives. So going through this pandemic, people aren't lazy. People want to work, but I think people have also realized that they can be productive and not necessarily need to go into an office space or to a warehouse every single day. So that goes back to your comment about the labor shortage. So if there is an ongoing labor shortage, I think what you're going to be faced with, as I said, necessity is the mother of invention. We're going to have to come up with solutions that will automate certain processes or the use of robots and automation to maybe not need so many people to do some of these types of jobs. So the realization with the labor shortage is it's only forcing the transportation industry to move faster towards automation and automated processes where they can. So in terms of the warehousing space, if 80% is still handled manually, there's a lot of room for growth there with parcel picking robots and autonomous pallet jacks, where you can use AI. You can use data to automate some of those processes to load pallets and optimize loads and get them onto the right trucks at the right time, the right location. And it takes out the need for a lot of the labor associated with that. So it's not to put people out of work, but basically if there's people that aren't interested in those types of jobs anymore, this is kind of a workaround to that. The technology is there. It's just investing in that technology and putting it to use.
Yeah, and there's an interesting another layer of technology in the warehouse that I've been reporting on a lot over the last, say, 9 to 12 months, which is sort of a coordination layer that bridges the gap between kind of existing technology in the warehouse, generally a WMS or a labor management type system, with some of these robotic systems, right? So you actually need a layer of orchestration between those two to optimize the investment in robotics and other automation, physical automation. So we're seeing a huge rise in that interest in that as well. And yeah, to your point, it's the goal is to elevate, not necessarily to replace, right? So obviously there will be some impacts to people who, might have been lured away into other industries anyway over time. So really interesting stuff. Very interesting. One other point I'd make, I spoke with recently with a 3PL and who's very tech focused, and this person, who the CEO, said our goal is for our employees to think up new ways for them to put their feet up, right? They should have as fulfilling a job as possible, and they should be thinking about taking stuff that is not very interesting to them off their plate and letting that be handled programmatically and really focusing their day-to-day on the interesting stuff. So that's sort of stuck in my head in terms of how automation plays a role in where things are going. But
it's a good way to look at it.
Yeah, exactly. We should all be thinking about ways we can kick our feet up a little more after doing the good work, right? Well, so let's maybe talk a bit more, about automation. This is especially on the sort of service side, and what we think of as kind of logistics or administrative kind of work around logistics. Where do you see companies that you're working with or that you're talking to? Where are they focusing their attention and their resources to in terms of incorporating automation?
Well, I can say from our own experience, we work with mostly carriers and 3PLs, and the main focus in the last year, certainly maybe 2 years, has been the use of mobile apps. That's really been the driver. We've had several customers out there that have put either software or hardware in the vehicles for drivers to be able to utilize to capture images and speed up the billing process. That's where most of the change is that we've seen. I think, moving ahead, you're going to be looking at the use of more analytics, more AI to make decisions, to automate certain decisions, to optimize loads, optimize fuel, to optimize the most efficient lanes. All of those things will be drivers in that. I think the use of mobile apps have the ability to capture a lot of that information through GPS tracking and things like that. So that will help drive kind of the next wave of tech. So you take baby steps, right? I mean, most people understand how to use mobile apps. So using that first to get you to the next step, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of the trend that we're seeing.
So if I'm understanding, the apps in sort of a passive way are feeding into this data, this pool of data that's accessible that you can do all sorts of other interesting stuff with. Is that a decent way to think about this?
That's correct. Yeah.
Well, so maybe let's dig a little bit into the data and analytics piece of this. That was the first thing you mentioned in your presentation, and yeah, we don't hear the term big data all that much anymore, because I think people are it's too much data, and it's what do I do with all the data? How do I filter it or edit it in such a way to actually do something about it, right? This is a challenge I hear about all the time, for whether it's a shipper, a carrier, a broker. Every party in the is probably capturing more than they know what to do with at this point. So how do you sort of help, or what would you advise to sort of help them, kind of create a framework to get better at decision making around the data that they have access to?
Sure, you're right. There is a huge amount of data out there, and the goal is to find a solution. What do we do with this data? So the goal is to look at the solution first. What you have all the data there to give you the answers. So what am I trying to solve for? What information do you need to make your business run more efficiently, more effectively, and more safely? What data do you collect today that'll help drive those solutions? So that would be a good place to start. After that, what data do you need to collect to provide those answers? And then can you do it yourself? If the answer is yes, then go for it. I mean, like I said, you collect data every single day. So being able to use analytics to your benefit, to do descriptive analytics or prescriptive analytics, it'll help you run more efficiently. If you don't have the ability to do that yourself, then find a partner, a provider that specializes in data collection and analytics, and they can help solve for some of those questions that you have on how to run more efficiently and more effectively.
Are there some clues that companies, because I think one of the things that I see companies struggling with data is they don't know the famous phrase, they don't know what they don't know. They may think that they're more proficient, or conversely, they may not realize they're more proficient than they actually are. Or they're as more proficient than they think they are, right? What sorts of clues are there to say that, hey, you've got a pretty good handle on your data situation?
That's a great question. I think for the companies out there, like the Old Dominions of the world, that they're pretty well dialed in to how to optimize. I think if you're looking at your data, you have a team in place that specializes in data analytics. They're going to help you solve some of those problems. If you don't invest any time and energy or resources into that, you're going to struggle, because the answers are always in the data. always. You can think that you run efficiently, but if you analyze the data thoroughly and you find the solution, you'll know for a fact whether or not you're running at an optimal level. So I would say probably the main thing that these companies should do is invest in an analytics team, either internally or outsource that to a company who specializes in it. That's the best approach you can take right now.
So that's a great lead in, because I wanted to explore this whole data science sort of piece, because I find this area from a talent perspective really interesting, because you have every company, it feels like, of all shapes and sizes, no matter where they are, whether it's in transportation or outside of transportation, I think they all have this idea that they need to get better at managing and understanding data, right? And sometimes that leads to looking for talent on the data science kind of spectrum. And yet there's not an unlimited amount of data scientists out there, much less good data scientists out there, right? And you're competing against software providers and companies like yourself and, very tech forward 3PLs. And that's just in our industry, not to mention all the competition outside of our industry for that same type of talent. How do you think we're going to get to a point where there's more data science talent kind of available, like, because this is such an emergent area, and we'll just start to see more people interested in that space and then interested in our corner of the world as it relates to that space?
I think so. I mean, I think, I think the free market will decide what jobs are needed where. And when you look at colleges and universities, they usually put programming in place to supply those types of jobs that are needed. So I think what you'll see is, and I don't know if you've seen the statistic on Bureau of Labor Statistics, they announced that over the next 10 years, there will be a growth of about 500,000 jobs in tech. And that's a huge number. So you're obviously going to have programs in place, and specifically in transportation and logistics space to support those needs. So I think, the free market will kind of decide, how to fill those jobs. And I think it's important. I think that, carriers are focused on moving freight. They're not necessarily focused on technology. So, that's an area that it's ripe for growth. And if we can put some emphasis in the technology space and data and analytics within transportation, I think you'll see a big change in some of these things that we talked about today with automation.
Well, that's interesting that you mentioned the role that kind of colleges and institutes of higher learning have to play in this, because we saw, obviously, over the last 15 years, we saw a huge amount of supply chain related educational programs at higher universities emerge. Whereas, early 2000s, you could count on one hand the number of universities that had sort of supply chain departments, right? And then now you cannot find a university that doesn't focus on this. So it would be interesting to see that same progression happen from a data science analytics kind of perspective. So really, really interesting thought there. What are some of the other challenges that you see companies facing when it comes to analytics, whether it's, ones you're directly working with, or whether they're tackling it on their own and you sort of are staying in touch with them? What are the challenges? I mean, I think we can all think about what the benefits might be, but I want to give people some encouragement that, a lot of people are challenged by this environment and you're not alone.
Well, I think you just nailed it on the head there, Eric. Basically, these carriers, like as I said, are focused on freight, on moving freight and getting it there as quickly as possible, getting paid as quickly as possible, and making sure that they have strong relationships with their customers. I think that a lot of carriers out there, with a few exceptions, they spend a little bit of time on data and analytics. They should be spending more time on data and analytics. I think that will solve a lot of the problems that they have. I think the focus has been on driving down cost, and that's important as well. But I think if you look at data, if you look at analytics, if you look at putting teams in place that can help you in those areas, you'll drive even more costs down, or save. In other words, you'll save a lot more money. So that's an area that I think they don't spend enough time on, and that's a real challenge across the industry. Not to say that that can't be solved, but I think more time needs to be spent on at least finding the right people that can help you solve some of these problems. Continue to stay focused on moving freight and having strong relationships with your customers, but spend a little bit more time on finding the people that can do some of these things for you to solve these problems.
Well, let's maybe transition a little bit into something that you guys specialize in. So the freight payment space, right? And invoice data. This is an area that I've written about a fair amount going back, to the late 2000s. Is this idea that there's so much latent kind of inefficiency, and then also a resultant sort of lack of use of data around an actual invoice, right? And so what are you seeing from a kind of next generation perspective about, digitizing that process as much as possible, and then using the data from the invoice for, in interesting ways that don't directly relate to just paying your bills?
Yeah. So the biggest change that we've seen in the last 15 years is, historically speaking, carriers would wait for trucks to come back to the terminals to scan the freight bills, and then the billing process would start. Production would start at that point. And that is still largely how a lot of carriers operate today. And a lot of times the 3PLs are reliant on that information as well. So it kind of bogs down the whole process. So the use of technology in the trucks, the ability to capture not just skeleton data, but capture the entire bill of lading, to help with dock operations running more efficiently, to advanced load planning. If you can get that process done while the truck is out on the road, and then as soon as that delivery is made, you have the ability to send out the invoice in real time and reduce your DSO. That's where it's at. That's where it needs to be, and that's what we've been seeing across the board with carriers. I think everybody's very excited about the idea of APIs and being able to share information in real time, but not everybody in the supply chain invests in technology at the exact same level. So this is kind of a good workaround to be able to speed up that process and get the data that you need in a somewhat real-time environment, without having to ask your customers to make a bunch of changes and do CapEx in technology.
Yeah, very interesting. And this is something I think about a lot, is the different paces at which different parties are adopting technology, and can the technology that the party that is invested in the most, can it sort of rise all the boats instead of dragging down to the one that's invested the least. So really interesting thought. So we have about a minute left. Maybe I'll ask, of all the technologies we talked about today, or even one that we maybe didn't get to, what are you most excited about in the years ahead? What do you think has the most promise?
Well, where do I start? I'm very excited about where the transportation industry is going in terms of its investment in technology. It's historically been a very archaic industry. Things have always been done kind of the way that the previous generation did them. And I've seen a ton of change in certainly in the last 5 years, in the younger generations coming in and understanding how technology can help their business. So seeing more and more companies spend a little bit more time on investing in that area. I think another important part that to consider is data security. We see it every single day. It seems like where a company gets hacked, whether it's ransomware or something else. So as I said before, carriers are focused on moving freight, and they invest in technology because their customers ask for it, or they feel a need to do that without putting much thought into security. So those are things that they need to consider as they move down that technology focused path. But it's very exciting to see the entire industry kind of moving in that direction slowly.
Yeah. Well, that's great. A hopeful thought and also a sober thought around data security, which is something we addressed briefly, but is really important in all this. Chad, thank you so much. It was a great conversation. Really learned a lot myself, and thanks for your great perspective on this. And thanks to everyone for tuning in. Hope you got as much out of it as I did. Thanks to SMC3 for having us both.
Thanks, Eric.